They skipped my wedding for my sister. Now their fake family image is ruined. I never imagined that one day I would stand on the precipice of my own wedding with my parents nowhere in sight. To everyone else, my family always seemed so picture-perfect, like the type of people who would volunteer at charity events, greet neighbors with homemade desserts, and boast about their children's accomplishments whenever they got the chance. But beneath that impeccable facade, there were cracks. And those cracks finally shattered when they chose my sister's whims over my once-in-a-lifetime moment. From as far back as I can remember, the entire focus of my parents' energy was my sister, Alicia. She was the poster child for extracurricular success, top of her class, a gifted pianist, a tennis champ in high school. Even her slightest achievements were greeted with lavish praise and adoration, while I learned to celebrate my own achievements quietly. I was neither invisible nor unloved, but everything I did was overshadowed by Alicia's next triumph. At some point, you sort of adapt, like your eyes adjusting to a room that's always dim. It's not normal, but it becomes your normal. So in the months leading up to my wedding, I remember thinking that for once it would finally be my turn to shine. My fiancé, Kyle, proposed to me in a small botanical garden near our house, surrounded by lush green arches of ivy and bursts of multicolored flowers. As soon as we announced our engagement, my mother's voice crackled through the phone with false enthusiasm. She said how happy she was for me, how excited she was to help plan the wedding. Yet, something in her tone sounded rehearsed. My father, on the other hand, was mostly silent and just occasionally mumbled an obligatory congratulations. Still, I allowed myself to dream of the day I'd walk down the aisle, wearing a gown so gorgeous it would take everyone's breath away. I pictured my parents seated in the front row, teary-eyed but so proud, cheering me on. That vision carried me through a lot of sleepless nights of wedding planning, budgeting, and dealing with the stress that every bride inevitably faces. Whenever I questioned how certain relatives would behave or worried about small details like flower arrangements, I reassured myself that the ceremony would overshadow all these minor issues. My wedding day would be about love and unity, right? Then Alicia dropped her bombshell. She was going to organize a major family reunion at the exact same time as my wedding. The family reunion, she explained, would be held near a beach resort, complete with fancy dinners, photo ops with extended relatives, and a big birthday celebration for her boyfriend. I remember the moment I found out because my mother casually slipped it into conversation as if it were no big deal. She was more focused on Alicia's new boyfriend, marveling at how sophisticated and accomplished he supposedly was, than the fact that the event she was describing clashed with my wedding day. She brushed my concerns aside with a dismissive wave of her hand, metaphorically, of course. We were on the phone, and promised to sort things out. Weeks passed, and I tried to keep calm, thinking that no matter how skewed my parents' priorities were, they would never skip my wedding for a beach resort gathering. But as time crawled closer to my wedding date, they dodged my calls or ended conversations abruptly whenever I asked if they had booked their flights or made any hotel reservations in my city. Their reluctance was so obvious that part of me already knew the truth. They weren't coming. However, I pushed away those feelings because the reality was too painful to contemplate. Then, with just 2 weeks until the ceremony, my mother called me out of the blue. She sounded oddly cheerful, like someone who has made a decision and wants to appear confident about it. She said, "Honey, we're so sorry, but you know how important this family reunion is to Alicia. She's put so much effort into making it special for everyone. We've tried to work out the dates, but it seems we're double booked." I could feel my grip on the phone tightening. My mouth felt dry and my voice came out as a shaky whisper. "But it's my wedding," I managed to say, tears already pricking at my eyes. Her next sentence shattered any illusions I had about them maybe, just maybe, changing their minds. "I promise we'll celebrate with you after," she said. "We'll throw you a beautiful party and it'll be just as good if not better." That was it. No guilt, no hesitation, just a hollow assurance of a belated get-together. The truth was plain as day. My parents had chosen my sister's event over my wedding. They didn't even try to put up the pretense of attending both. The days leading up to the ceremony felt like a nightmare I couldn't wake up from. Every time Kyle asked if my parents were coming, I just shook my head, torn between anger and sorrow. I tried to focus on finalizing the seating chart, writing out vows, and staying on top of the million small tasks a wedding entails. But none of it felt joyous anymore. Instead, everything came wrapped in a dull ache, because my family, the people who are supposed to be there no matter what, chose not to be. As the hours ticked closer to my wedding day, I clung to the hope that they would change their minds at the last minute. Maybe they would realize what they'd done, realize how thoroughly they'd hurt me, and rush over in time for the ceremony, unannounced but repentant. I kept imagining a dramatic scene straight out of a movie, my mother bursting through the church doors, tears streaming down her face, whispering, "I'm sorry." But that's not how real life works. What I didn't anticipate was how quickly everything would unravel for them. In the haze of heartbreak, I didn't realize that the facade they so carefully cultivated, the model family image they flaunted around friends and neighbors, was about to crumble. And it wouldn't just be because they skipped my wedding for a beachside get-together. There was far more brewing under the surface, and soon enough, the entire world would see just how brittle their perfect veneer really was. The morning of my wedding was a blur of emotions, the kind that make your heart pound so loudly in your chest you can barely concentrate on what's happening around you. I woke up in a quiet panic, trying to shove down the hollow ache I felt at the knowledge that my parents wouldn't be there. Outside the window of the little bed and breakfast where I was staying, the sun was already starting its climb, casting long, gentle rays across the old wooden porch. It should have felt idyllic. But all I could think about was the empty seats where my mother and father would have been. My bridesmaids, my 3 closest friends, did their best to fill the room with excitement. They chatted about the decorations, the music, and how stunning my dress looked in the morning light. "It's going to be perfect," one of them kept insisting, probably noticing the tension in my shoulders that no amount of professional makeup could fully hide. I tried to smile, to engage in the banter about whether the cake table was set up properly and if the florist had delivered enough roses. But every time I glanced at my phone, I hoped for a last-minute text from my parents saying, "We're on our way, wait for us." I knew better than to hold my breath. Still, it felt impossible to stop myself from checking my notifications. There was nothing, of course, but each moment of silence screamed louder than any message could. My heart felt like a heavy stone. I was about to walk down the aisle without my mom to fuss over my train and my dad to offer his arm. In a perfect world, this day was supposed to be about stepping forward into a new life with Kyle. Yet I couldn't shake the feeling that I was simultaneously losing something. If not my parents' love, then my faith in it. Eventually, though, the time came. My bridesmaids ushered me into a sleek black car, carefully maneuvering my dress so it wouldn't wrinkle. At the small church where the ceremony was being held, everything was laid out exactly how I'd planned. Rows of delicate white flowers lined the pews, and gentle music, played by one of Kyle's friends, drifted through the open doors. Guests were already chatting in hushed voices as they took their seats, and I could see a few heads turning, scanning the crowd for my family. It was painfully obvious that the 2 seats up front remained empty. I stood there, hidden from view for just a moment, feeling the weight of the day on my shoulders. My maid of honor squeezed my hand, whispering that it was time to walk. So I did what every bride does. I straightened my back, put one foot in front of the other, and tried to savor the significance of the moment despite the knot in my stomach. When I reached Kyle at the altar, his eyes were shining with warmth and something that resembled heartbreak on my behalf. He knew how much my parents' absence hurt me. As he took my hands in his, I could sense he was silently telling me, "I'm here, I've got you, we're going to be okay." Even now, replaying that memory in my mind, my throat tightens. No matter how much disappointment I carried, I also felt gratitude that the person I loved most was standing beside me, ready to take on our future together. The ceremony itself was both beautiful and bittersweet. My voice trembled when I said my vows, a mix of nerves and suppressed sadness. I'm sure at least half the guests noticed my shaky voice, but they probably chalked it up to the emotion of the moment. I heard a few sniffles as Kyle said his own vows, which were filled with sincerity and promises that felt like unbreakable bonds. It was the kind of moment every bride dreams of, yet I couldn't banish the bitter taste in my mouth. I wasn't wearing a borrowed piece of jewelry from my mother, and there was no heartfelt father-daughter moment. It felt wrong that these 2 people who had shaped my life from the very beginning were missing. As we turned to face our friends and family, minus my parents, the applause was thunderous and there were genuine smiles everywhere. It was like they were all trying to make up for the empty seats in spirit. Part of me was touched, but a larger part of me felt numb. I'd done it. I'd married the love of my life and taken a massive step forward. but the day was also marked by a distinct absence, a gaping hole in my heart. Reception took place in a charming garden behind the church, where long tables were adorned with candles and fresh flowers. We had a small dance floor set up under a canopy of fairy lights. Everyone raved about the food and the music, and as the night went on, the laughter seemed to grow louder. People clinked their glasses for toasts, one after another, leaving me both touched and overwhelmed. Some guests took me aside to whisper their sympathy, telling me they couldn't believe my parents hadn't shown up. A few looked enraged on my behalf, while others just shook their heads in disbelief. Despite everything, I tried to stay in the moment as much as possible. I laughed with my friends, slow danced with Kyle under the shimmering lights, and cut the cake with shaky hands that were equal parts excitement and lingering sorrow. If you looked at the photographs from that evening, you'd see a bride trying her best to focus on love, joy, and the hope of a bright future. But I knew deep down that the truth was complicated. Even as the celebration wound down and the night sky enveloped us, I kept imagining a different scenario. My parents walking in late, tears in their eyes, realizing their mistake. In my mind, I conjured a dozen excuses for why they hadn't arrived on time, but reality is often unkind. The wedding ended without any sight of my parents. When I finally removed my wedding gown and laid it carefully over a chair, I felt an odd mixture of relief and heartbreak. The day I had been dreaming about for so long was done, and yet it felt so incomplete. That night, after the guests had left and the candles had burned down, Kyle and I sat in the quiet stillness of the nearly empty venue. He wrapped his arms around me, and for a moment, I allowed myself the tears I'd been holding back all day. My family was changing before my eyes, and I wasn't sure if it would ever be the same again. What I didn't realize was that the unraveling was only beginning. I thought the worst had already happened, the heartbreak of their absence. But in truth, the real fallout was just around the corner. And it would reveal secrets about my parents, my sister, and the lengths people go to preserve a perfect image, even if it means sacrificing the happiness of their own child. In the days following the wedding, I found myself caught in a whirlwind of conflicting emotions. On one hand, I was newly married to Kyle, the man who had held my hand through every heartbreak leading up to our big day. On the other, a hollow ache remained from the absence of my parents, and the persistent confusion over how they could so casually choose Alicia's beachside family reunion over my once-in-a-lifetime moment. Even as I woke up next to Kyle each morning, feeling his warmth and love, my mind wrestled with what all of this meant for the future. Would my parents ever truly apologize, or even acknowledge how deeply they had hurt me? Or was I doomed to spend the rest of my life wrestling with my resentment and sorrow, trying to mend a relationship that had always felt one-sided at best? The first full day we spent as a married couple was blissful in an odd way. Kyle and I had planned a short getaway, more of a mini-moon than a honeymoon, just a couple of hours from our hometown. It wasn't extravagant, but it was perfect for us. A cozy cottage by a serene lake, where we could unwind in the quiet, watch ducks glide across the water, and bask in the euphoria of being newlyweds. Despite all the turmoil swirling around me, I forced myself to focus on the joy. We went for long walks along wooded paths, hand in hand, talking about everything except my parents. For a brief moment, it felt like I could breathe again, free from the heavy burden of disappointment. Still, the specter of their absence lingered. When the evenings grew dark, and we settled into the living room of that little cottage with cups of tea or hot chocolate, my thoughts inevitably drifted. I would find myself staring out the window at the reflection of the moonlight dancing across the lake's surface, wondering if my mother was also looking at the night sky, thinking of me. Or if my father, whose presence I'd always taken for granted, even if he was never as openly affectionate, felt any ounce of regret. I had no messages from either of them. Nothing but digital silence and the haunting knowledge that they were likely somewhere taking group photos in front of a resort, perhaps laughing and talking about Alicia's future plans. When our mini-moon ended, the drive back home was somber. Kyle knew me well enough to sense the tension coiling inside me. He suggested we stop at one of those quaint roadside diners for pie, trying to inject a bit of normalcy back into my mood. I appreciated his efforts and even managed a small laugh when the waitress insisted on taking our picture because we looked so in love. For a moment, I thought, this is what a happy couple's life should feel like, simple, shared joys. But the second we pulled up to our apartment building, and I saw the envelope stuffed into our mailbox, reality came rushing back. Amid the usual bills and junk mail, there was a single envelope from my parents. At first, I held it as though it were a bomb about to explode. My hands trembled slightly, and Kyle placed a reassuring hand on my back. We stood there, on the edge of the parking lot, debating whether to open it immediately or wait until we got inside. My curiosity won, and with a hesitant tug, I tore it open. Inside was a greeting card that read, "Congratulations on your wedding," in a font so generic it looked like they'd grabbed the first thing off the supermarket shelf. The handwriting was my mother's, a neat and practiced script. "We're sorry we couldn't make it, but we hope you understand we had obligations with extended family. Congratulations again to you and Kyle. We look forward to celebrating with you soon." No mention of how devastated I must have felt, no explanation that delved deeper than the surface, and certainly no attempt at an apology beyond the breezy "sorry we couldn't make it." It felt like a slap in the face, wrapped in pastel-colored stationery. The card was signed, "Love, Mom and Dad," as if this entire fiasco could be smoothed over by a Hallmark sentiment. In the days that followed, I struggled with how to respond. Part of me wanted to confront them directly, to call them up and let them hear just how deeply their betrayal cut. Another part of me felt drained, as though I had no energy left to fight. My entire life, I had tiptoed around their favoritism toward Alicia, never wanting to make waves. Now the waves were crashing against me, and I wasn't sure if I had it in me to push back or simply let myself drown in silence. I tried to distract myself by focusing on the practical aftermath of the wedding. There were thank you notes to write, photos to go through, and gifts to organize. Each of those tasks, though, carried a tinge of sadness. People who had attended the wedding asked if they should send pictures to my parents, not realizing how raw the wound still was. Some relatives who lived far away reached out to ask if my parents were okay, sensing some kind of family tension, but not fully understanding the depth of the rift. Each time I had to explain, or even hint at the situation, I felt my frustration flare up again. Then came the unexpected call, a call from a cousin on my dad's side. She wasn't particularly close to me, but we'd always gotten along during family gatherings. Her voice sounded urgent, almost frantic, as she asked me if what she was hearing was true. I pressed her to clarify, and she told me about a rumor that was circulating, that my parents had claimed they weren't invited to the wedding at all. My cousin wanted to verify this, because she had seen my wedding invitation displayed on my mother's kitchen counter a few weeks prior. She found it odd that my parents were now telling people they had no formal invitation, as if that were the reason they didn't attend. My blood boiled at the realization that my parents were trying to rewrite the narrative, twisting the story to preserve their own image. Everything I'd suspected about them, how they cared more about appearances and excuses than reality, suddenly felt magnified. Here they were, not content to simply skip my wedding, but actually lying about the reason. It was a huge slap in the face, confirming that any semblance of sincerity in that lukewarm apology card was purely for show. I thanked my cousin for letting me know and ended the call, my hands shaking. Kyle, who had been in the living room playing some soft music, saw my expression and immediately muted the speakers. He asked what happened, and I explained. As the words tumbled out of my mouth, rage swirled through me, mingling with hurt and disbelief. The betrayal I had felt on my wedding day was nothing compared to the sting of realizing my parents were actively spreading lies to dodge accountability. And as much as I wanted to confront them right then and there, I also felt the ominous weight of the bigger fallout that was about to come. Because if my parents were capable of lying so blatantly about something like this, then there was no telling how far they would go to protect their carefully curated image. The days following my cousin's phone call were a whirlwind of simmering anger and unresolved questions. I kept replaying her words, feeling my face flush each time I recalled how my parents tried to claim they weren't invited to my wedding at all. It was like a bad soap opera, but worse, because this wasn't fiction. This was my life. I couldn't wrap my mind around their audacity. How could they look at the physical invitation that had sat on their own kitchen counter, and then turn around to tell relatives they never received one? It was the sort of brazen lie that felt designed to make me look like the guilty party, as though I'd excluded them out of spite. Kyle watched me pace around the living room, biting my nails and picking up my phone every few minutes, debating whether to call my parents directly. A part of me longed to dial their number just to demand answers. No, not even answers, but at least the decency of an honest conversation. I wanted them to acknowledge their betrayal, to address it head-on, to show me something that resembled remorse. But each time I hovered over the contact labeled Mom and Dad, a heavy dread weighed on my chest. Would confronting them outright open a path toward understanding, or just deepen the chasm between us? The tension was so palpable that Kyle suggested we go for a drive, maybe clear our heads. We ended up on the outskirts of town, passing miles of farmland where the tall grass swayed in a late summer breeze. The quiet of the open road offered a brief respite from my roiling emotions. For a moment, the sun glinting off the car's windshield and the wind rushing through the slightly opened windows reminded me that there was still a world outside my family drama. As if sensing my mood, Kyle reached over and gently squeezed my hand. I forced a half-smile, grateful for his support, but unable to fully shake off the turmoil in my mind. That evening, back in our apartment, I made the decision to take a direct approach. I opened my laptop, determined to send an email to my parents. A phone call felt too raw, too immediate. An email would let me articulate my thoughts clearly, without the risk of my voice cracking or my anger spiraling out of control. I spent almost an hour typing and retyping that message, trying to strike the right balance between honesty and restraint. I wrote about how hurt I was that they had chosen Alicia's event over my wedding, and I confronted them about the rumor they'd spread. Then I closed with a simple request. Please be honest with me. If you truly believed I didn't invite you, explain how you came to that conclusion. If not, tell me why you're lying. I hit send, my heart hammering in my chest. The next 24 hours crawled by. Each ping from my phone or computer made me jump, half expecting a lengthy reply from my parents. But none came. The silence gnawed at me. I went through the motions of everyday life, grocery shopping, picking up dry cleaning, finishing some freelance work I'd neglected during the wedding planning. But all the while, I was acutely aware of the black hole that existed between my parents and me. On the second evening, just as Kyle and I were sitting down to a late dinner, a notification popped up on my phone, an email from my mother. My stomach did a somersault. I opened it right then and there, ignoring the forkful of spaghetti already halfway to my mouth. The message was surprisingly brief, just a couple of sentences. My mother insisted the entire thing was a misunderstanding and that I was overreacting. She then mentioned that Alicia had apparently told them I never wanted them at the wedding. The email concluded with a dismissive, "We can talk more about it when you're ready to act like a respectful daughter." My head spun. Alicia told them I never wanted them at my wedding. She knew that couldn't be further from the truth. Why would she concoct such a blatant lie, especially when she must have seen the invitation? And the cherry on top was my mother's remark about me needing to be respectful. As if I was the one instigating this drama. I felt my chest tighten with anger. It was as though every grievance I'd ever had with my parents and sister was colliding in my head at once. Kyle took one look at my expression and cleared our plates, giving me the space and time to process my mother's words. That night I hardly slept. Each time I closed my eyes, I imagined Alicia whispering these lies to our parents, fueling the notion that I'd excluded them. In every memory I had of growing up, Alicia always played the role of the golden child, bright, charismatic, and forever praised. I was the quieter one, the child whose achievements never quite merited the same fanfare. But this went beyond sibling rivalry. It felt like sabotage. I couldn't fathom why she would go to such lengths. Yet a small, nagging voice in the back of my mind reminded me how Alicia relished being the center of attention. If that meant painting me as the villain, perhaps she saw it as a necessary sacrifice. The following day, I decided to take matters into my own hands and speak with Alicia directly. It was late afternoon when I dialed her number. Oddly enough, she picked up on the second ring. I could almost visualize the smug expression on her face as she greeted me with a drawn-out hello. I didn't bother with small talk. In a clipped tone, I asked her why she told our parents I never wanted them at my wedding. She hesitated for just a moment, long enough for me to sense a rush of panic behind her practiced confidence, before launching into a convoluted explanation. She claimed she'd heard me say something in passing months ago that suggested I didn't care if Mom and Dad came or not. According to Alicia, she simply relayed that sentiment to them. Even if I'd ever said anything like that in anger or exasperation, and I was sure I hadn't, it wouldn't have nullified the very real invitation I had mailed to my parents' home. I quickly pointed that out. That's when Alicia's tone shifted. She became defensive. insinuating that maybe I'd only sent the invitation to look good, and not because I genuinely wanted them there. My hand shook around the phone as she spoke. She was twisting the narrative so completely that I felt like I was inside some bizarre, parallel universe where facts didn't matter. By the time I hung up, my head throbbed. Alicia had shown no remorse. If anything, she sounded annoyed that I dared to call her out. This tug-of-war over who said what and when was exhausting, and I felt like I had no real mediator in my family. My parents were planted firmly in Alicia's corner, and she was more than happy to stoke the flames. Anger flickered through me like a lit match, but there was also sorrow. How could someone I'd grown up alongside, someone who shared my childhood bedroom and countless memories, turn so callous? That evening, I curled up on the couch with Kyle, letting the weight of it all settle in. My life was changing faster than I could process. Newly married, dealing with a family in turmoil, and now discovering the web of lies Alicia was weaving, each realization made me question if I'd ever truly known my sister. While my parents continued to paint me as the ungrateful daughter, Alicia was busy playing puppeteer. And yet, amidst the chaos, a small part of me still held on to hope that the truth would eventually come out, that the facade my parents and Alicia were so desperate to maintain would finally crumble. Because I knew one thing for certain. After missing my wedding and lying about it, there was no turning back to how things used to be. My parents might still present their picture-perfect veneer to the world, but it was already cracking at the seams, and it was only a matter of time before the rest of our family and friends saw it, too. A few weeks after that confrontational phone call with Alicia, life took on a strained sense of normalcy. I continued working, running errands, and nesting into married life with Kyle. Yet in the background, my phone buzzed sporadically with confused messages from extended family members, cousins, aunts, and even a few old family friends, trying to figure out what exactly had happened at my wedding and what hadn't happened with my parents. Each conversation set my nerves on edge. Some people asked gentle questions, clearly not wanting to pry too hard. Others were more direct, openly expressing their anger on my behalf. But one theme ran consistently through every interaction, a mixture of disbelief and pity. I hated pity. It made me feel like a wounded animal and that the onlookers were half expecting me to lick my wounds in public. So I tried my best to keep the details minimal. It's complicated, I'd say, or it was just a scheduling conflict if I wasn't in the mood to rehash the painful truth. All the while, I was intensely aware that Alicia and my parents were still perpetuating their version of events. From what I gleaned, their story shifted depending on the audience. Sometimes they claimed they'd never received an invite, other times that they had urgent matters that took precedence. The specifics changed, but the result was always the same, a convenient excuse that absolved them of wrongdoing. Then came an unexpected message from a woman named Rochelle. She was a mutual friend of my mother, and had attended many of our family gatherings over the years, baby showers, birthday parties, even some holiday dinners. Rochelle and I weren't close, but she sent me a polite direct message on social media one evening, saying she had some information I might want to know. My initial reaction was a jolt of apprehension. Information about what? But curiosity quickly got the better of me, so I replied and arranged a time to meet for coffee. I showed up at the little cafe a few minutes early, nerves jangling. Rochelle arrived shortly after, wearing a look that was half concerned, half wary, like she was stepping into a soap opera scene. She ordered a latte, and once we settled into a quiet corner, she leaned in, her eyes flitting around to make sure no one was eavesdropping. Without much preamble, she confided that she'd heard my sister's relationship wasn't exactly what it seemed, and that Alicia was spinning an entirely separate web of lies about her new boyfriend, a story that might be impacting how my parents handled, or mishandled, everything else. Apparently, Alicia had told my parents that her boyfriend was a high-level executive in some prestigious firm. Rochelle's husband, however, worked in a similar field and discovered that Alicia's boyfriend was nowhere near an executive. In fact, he had a reputation for embellishing his credentials. This wasn't exactly the end of the world, but it did raise questions about why my parents were so invested in Alicia's illusions, why they would risk alienating me just to bolster her image. I felt a strange, tight knot in my stomach listening to Rochelle, part shock, part disappointment, and part grim validation. For years, I had sensed that my parents valued appearances more than actual substance. Now it felt like the entire world was starting to see it too. We talked for nearly an hour, our coffee turning lukewarm as Rochelle rattled off other examples she'd caught wind of. Alicia claiming she had been accepted into an exclusive program she hadn't, presenting a lavish lifestyle on social media, all on credit cards she could barely pay, and worst of all, implying that she and her boyfriend were house hunting for a dream home. Rochelle's theory was that my parents had pinned all their hopes on Alicia's grandeur, so they were going along with every deception to maintain that polished exterior. Whether that was out of denial, unconditional love, or sheer stubbornness was anyone's guess. When Rochelle finally stood to leave, she touched my arm gently. "I hope this gives you some clarity," she said, her voice sympathetic. "I know it doesn't make up for them missing your wedding, but at least you can see where their heads might be at. It's not about you, it's about whatever story they're trying to uphold." I nodded, my throat tight, thanking her. Then I sat there for a while, letting the cafe chatter wash over me as I processed what she had told me. It both stung and relieved me to hear that my parents' actions had more to do with Alicia's fabricated life than with me personally. Still, how could they betray me so deeply over a mirage? Back home, I shared the highlights of Rochelle's revelations with Kyle. He didn't seem as surprised as I'd expected. "I had a feeling something bigger was going on," he admitted softly. "People don't just skip their daughter's wedding without a major reason." He speculated that perhaps Alicia was blackmailing my parents emotionally, holding out the promise of her success and financial stability if they played along. I began to wonder if there was something even darker lurking below the surface. Had Alicia threatened to cut them off if they showed up to my wedding instead of her event? Or was this purely about them feeding her ego because they'd always favored her? As these thoughts churned in my mind, I realized how toxic the entire situation was becoming. If my parents were willing to sabotage my wedding, spread rumors, gaslight me, do whatever it took to avoid tarnishing Alicia's image, where did it end? How far would they go to protect this curated persona they'd cultivated? And if Alicia's boyfriend was as much of a fraud as Rochelle implied, wouldn't that eventually blow up in their faces? The more I considered it, the more I felt a strange sense of inevitability, as though we were standing at the threshold of a scandal no one could stop. That weekend, I received a phone call from a longtime family friend, Mrs. Atwood. She was a sweet, elderly woman who had known me since I was a baby. I could sense the hesitation in her voice. She didn't want to upset me, but she'd heard so many conflicting stories that she needed to confirm what was true. She asked plainly if my parents had ever received an invitation to my wedding. I assured her they had, and she let out a weary sigh, muttering something about how she feared as much. As we chatted, she let slip that she'd been to dinner at my parents' house recently. My father apparently spent half the evening ranting about disrespectful children who don't appreciate their families. Mrs. Atwood said she nearly walked out because she was so disgusted by the insinuations. By the time I hung up, my pulse was pounding in my ears. My father's words stung more than I cared to admit, even if I suspected they were rooted in denial or shame. The love of a parent is supposed to be unwavering, right? Yet here he was, painting me as the ungrateful child, the problem child, all because he couldn't face his own choice to skip my wedding. If that was how he coped, then maybe he was in deeper denial than I realized. Late that night, as I scrolled through social media trying to unwind, I came across photos posted by Alicia. She and her boyfriend were posing at some ritzy beachside restaurant, drinks in hand, her caption gushing about how hard work pays off. The comments were flooded with congratulatory messages about their supposedly new business venture, and my parents were among the first to chime in with heart emojis and proud statements. It felt like a twisting knife, a public demonstration that they would rather pour their energy into Alicia's illusions than acknowledge the hurt they caused me. But instead of anger, I felt a creeping sense of inevitability. This entire house of cards was going to collapse, and when it did, I wouldn't be the only one left reeling. I placed my phone on the nightstand, my heart heavy with the knowledge that my parents' carefully crafted facade was wearing thinner by the day. Lies don't stay hidden forever, and Alicia's illusions were stacking up in a dangerous pile of shaky half-truths. Eventually, something would snap, and the fallout would be massive. I just didn't know yet if my family would ever be the same when that day finally came, or if there was any hope left at all for us to repair the damage they'd caused by skipping my wedding and pretending it was all my fault. I wish I could say I was shocked when the next series of events began to unfold, but in a strange way, I'd been bracing for it. Whether it was Rochelle's warnings, the suspicious glorification of Alicia's new boyfriend, or the blatant lies my parents were feeding to relatives, everything felt like it was teetering on the edge. I just didn't expect everything to accelerate so swiftly or so publicly. Even now, looking back, it's astonishing how quickly a carefully manicured family image can unravel once the threads start to fray. It started with a single social media post, not from Alicia this time, but from a mutual acquaintance who had attended her so-called family reunion. This acquaintance, let's call her Brittany, wasn't exactly close to me, but she'd been at a couple of my parents' events over the years. One evening, while scrolling through my feed, I saw Brittany's new post showcasing the reunion that had so conveniently overlapped my wedding. She shared a gallery of images, Alicia raising a toast, my parents smiling broadly, and a handful of distant cousins basking in the beachside glow. It looked like a carefree vacation, everyone in matching resort wear, exuding a sense of unity. And there was a caption that made me stop short. Brittany had written, "Family is everything, even when schedules clash, we still find a way to celebrate the important moments." It struck me like a slap in the face. My wedding was an important moment, too, yet there they were, radiating joy and seemingly unburdened by the fact that they hadn't just clashed schedules. They'd outright chosen Alicia's event over mine. Anger burned in my chest, but deeper than that, I felt the sting of betrayal anew. Within a day or two, that post started getting traction among our extended family network. People were commenting, some cheerfully unaware of the drama, others hinting at the tension. One relative wrote something like, "Great to see everyone together, but I wish more of us could have gone to both family events," followed by a forced smiley emoji. The subtext was clear. Half the family was caught between wanting to congratulate Alicia on her beachside celebration and wanting to stand in solidarity with me. And the more people who became aware that my parents hadn't just missed the wedding out of some last-minute emergency, the more friction built up. Then came the phone calls. My mother took it upon herself to conduct what I can only describe as damage control. A couple of aunts told me that she'd called them in a flurry, offering a new official story. Apparently, they'd been forced to attend Alicia's event because Alicia had spun some dramatic tale about an unexpected health scare in her boyfriend's family, and my parents simply couldn't leave them alone in that time of crisis. Of course, no one could confirm that story, least of all me, but it reeked of one more convenient cover-up. Whether it was a last-ditch effort to shore up sympathy or a ploy to make me look unreasonable, I had no idea. All I could do was grit my teeth each time I heard a new variation of the same lie. Still, I might have let the situation ride, if not for a sudden influx of messages from family friends who were starting to piece things together. One of my mom's closest friends, a woman named Daniela, reached out to tell me how worried she was. Apparently, my mother had confided to her, off the record, that Alicia's boyfriend might be fabricating his professional background. According to Daniela, my mother was torn between confronting Alicia and maintaining the charade that everything was fine and dandy. As infuriating as it was to hear that my mother did have her doubts, I couldn't help but feel a pang of pity. My parents were so entangled in this web of lies, some spun by Alicia, some by themselves, that they no longer seemed sure what was real. Meanwhile, Alicia continued to flood her social media with opulent posts, dinners at upscale restaurants, snapshots in what looked like VIP lounges, and stories about upcoming ventures. The comments from my parents were glowing as ever, filled with heart emojis and lines like "so proud of you," or "our rising star." It was almost nauseating to watch. But even in the midst of their public adoration, small cracks were appearing. A few curious people started asking, "So, where exactly do you work?" Or "when is that big project launching?" Alicia's replies were vague or deflective. It was clear that more than one person was starting to question her claims. One evening, Kyle and I were lounging on our living room couch, our day's work behind us, when my phone lit up with a text from my Aunt Sylvia. She's my mother's younger sister and has never been one to mince words. "We need to talk," was all the text said. My stomach flipped. Within minutes, I was in a call with her, bracing myself for whatever news she had. Sylvia sounded uncharacteristically frazzled. She told me she'd just come from a small get-together at my parents' home. Over coffee and dessert, Alicia's boyfriend started boasting about a massive contract he'd supposedly secured. He threw around lofty figures and brand names, as if listing them off a script. Sylvia's husband, who happens to be quite knowledgeable in that specific industry, politely asked a few follow-up questions. Nothing too invasive, just the standard, "What division are you in?" Or "When does the project commence?" Within moments, Alicia's boyfriend turned evasive, stumbling through half-baked excuses. My sister promptly jumped in, swatting down the questions, claiming it was confidential information. According to Sylvia, the entire room went uncomfortably silent. My father tried to lighten the mood, and my mother changed the subject. But everyone present had witnessed the awkward collision of fantasy and reality. After the guests left, Sylvia stayed behind to help my mother tidy up. That's when my mother allegedly broke down, ranting about how she felt trapped. She wouldn't elaborate much further in front of my aunt, only saying that Alicia was putting pressure on them, and that they felt they had no choice but to support Alicia's claims to keep the family together. My aunt told me that my father was seething in the background, packing the living room and muttering about how no one respects their decisions. Hearing that, I couldn't help but recall the wedding fiasco, how he'd labeled me a disrespectful daughter when he was the one who failed to show up for my day. The hypocrisy still stunned me. Sylvia ended the call with a sigh, advising me to be prepared for anything. She hinted that more drama was likely on the horizon, because once the extended family caught wind of Alicia's boyfriend's obvious evasiveness, the rumor mill would spin wildly. And that, of course, would blow open the question of why my parents were so staunchly defending someone with such a murky background, especially over their own daughter. I hung up feeling an odd mixture of relief and dread. Relief, because it validated what I'd suspected for a while. My parents knew Alicia's stories weren't adding up. They were just as trapped in her illusions as Alicia was in the need to maintain them. But dread, because I could see how this could escalate. Once people started pulling at the loose threads, asking direct questions, connecting dots, the entire tapestry of Alicia's grand deception would inevitably unravel. And my parents, who had staked their credibility and relationships on supporting her, would fall into the wreckage too. As I lay in bed that night, Kyle's steady breathing beside me, I stared up at the ceiling, my thoughts swirling. The world had grown unrecognizable in the span of a few months. My wedding was overshadowed and missed by the very people who should have been front and center. Now they were backed into a corner, propping up Alicia's stories to maintain an illusion of success and familial harmony. But illusions can only last so long, and it appeared that time was swiftly running out. The facade was cracking, revealing the shaky foundation beneath. And no matter what happened next, I had a sinking feeling that once this house of cards fell, there would be no graceful way to put it back together. A few weeks after my conversation with Aunt Sylvia, the tension in the family felt like a coiled spring ready to snap. Everywhere I turned, there were hushed phone calls, sideways glances, and awkward text messages from people I barely knew, all looking for some kernel of truth about Alicia, her boyfriend, and my parents, unwavering support of their dubious claims. While part of me dreaded the inevitable blow-up, another part of me couldn't help but anticipate a sense of relief that would come once everything was out in the open. Still, I had no idea just how dramatic the unraveling would be, or how permanent the scars would become. It started with an announcement. Alicia's boyfriend was supposedly hosting a celebratory dinner to share news of a life-changing opportunity. Naturally, my parents were thrilled, talking up the event to anyone who would listen. Even though I dreaded going, Aunt Sylvia convinced me that my presence might show everyone that I wasn't hiding from the situation. Kyle, who'd stayed remarkably calm through all of this, agreed that while it could be awkward, it might offer closure. So against my better judgment, I accepted the invitation. The venue was an upscale restaurant downtown, the sort of place I'd never typically see Alicia frequent, at least, not without a generous credit limit. But she and her boyfriend had spared no expense. The dining area was dimly lit, all polished wood and sparkling glassware. My parents stood near the entrance, greeting guests with forced smiles. The instant my mother saw me, her eyes flickered with a mixture of surprise and something that felt almost like dread. She quickly masked it with a thin-lipped smile and mumbled a stiff hello. My father avoided eye contact entirely, busying himself with the wine list as though he were a connoisseur, even though I knew he didn't drink. As Kyle and I made our way around the room, I noticed many of the faces were the same folks who had attended Alicia's beachside family reunion. But instead of the easy, carefree laughter I saw in those photos, there was a distinct undercurrent of tension. People were chatting in low voices, and every so often, a couple of them would glance at Alicia's boyfriend, dressed in an obviously expensive suit, wearing an even more obvious attempt at confidence, and exchange knowing looks. Finally, Alicia and her boyfriend took center stage at the head of the table, tapping a fork against a champagne glass for attention. Alicia beamed, though the smile never quite reached her eyes. Her boyfriend cleared his throat and began a grandiose speech about how he'd landed a major international contract and was about to open the doors to a life of abundance. He went on to list a string of corporations he was supposedly collaborating with, dropping financial figures that would make even the wealthiest person in the room raise an eyebrow. Alicia stood beside him, nodding along, as my parents practically glowed with pride. But then came the moment everything changed. A man I recognized, Sylvia's husband, spoke up. He calmly asked a few pointed questions about the specifics of these alleged collaborations. At first, the boyfriend responded with vague buzzwords and jargon, but the more Sylvia's husband pressed, the more flustered Alicia's boyfriend became. "That's proprietary," he snapped at one point, glancing at Alicia in desperation. She tried to rescue him by deflecting, laughing nervously, "Oh, he can't share all his secrets." But it was too late. The tension in the room was palpable, like everyone was collectively holding their breath, waiting for the other shoe to drop. Sylvia's husband persisted, pointing out certain discrepancies, that the corporation in question didn't even have a division in the region Alicia's boyfriend claimed. A hush fell over the group. My parents squirmed, exchanging frantic glances. Alicia's face went pale, and her boyfriend shifted from foot to foot, mumbling nonsensical explanations that contradicted what he'd said moments earlier. It was like watching a car skid on black ice. Unstoppable, disastrous, but impossible to turn away from. As it became obvious that the story was collapsing, my father tried to step in. He raised his voice, accusing everyone of badgering Alicia's boyfriend. "If you don't believe us, that's your problem," he fumed, slamming a palm down on the table. That only drew more attention, as guests started whispering to each other. My mother looked on the verge of tears, her face flushed a deep red as though she, too, knew this charade was coming apart at the seams. Alicia's boyfriend tried to regain control, muttering something about non-disclosure agreements, but the damage was done. It all happened in a matter of minutes. The grand announcement, the probing questions, the veiled panic, all culminating in a mass exodus. People excused themselves with polite nods or muttered that they had early mornings ahead. Within half an hour, the once bustling dining area had mostly cleared out, leaving a handful of stunned onlookers, my parents, Alicia, her boyfriend, and me. The restaurant manager hovered near the edge of the room, eyeing us with concern, undoubtedly sensing that the evening was veering into meltdown territory. Alicia turned on me then, her voice trembling with rage. "You just had to show up and ruin everything," she hissed, as though I had orchestrated Sylvia's husband's questions. My heart pounded. I opened my mouth to defend myself, but a lump formed in my throat. What could I even say? I'd done nothing wrong. I was just there, watching her lies crumble. My father glared at me, too, as if I were the cause of all their misery. In that moment, it was crystal clear. They didn't want the truth, and they certainly didn't want me there to witness their downfall. They wanted a scapegoat. Kyle stepped forward, quietly but firmly telling Alicia to back off. My sister spat something that sounded like a curse under her breath, before storming out with her boyfriend trailing behind. My mother and father followed suit, shooting me hostile looks. Suddenly, I was the villain. Never mind that their entire life-fueled empire had just imploded. In the aftermath, Kyle and I stood near the now empty table, stunned by how quickly the evening had descended into chaos. As we walked outside, the warm night air felt stifling. The street was quiet, punctuated only by the distant sound of traffic. We lingered on the sidewalk, processing what had just happened. I felt a bittersweet sense of finality. The illusions were gone, and with them, any hope that my parents' fake family image might remain intact. They had chosen to prop up Alicia's fantasies at the expense of my wedding, my feelings, and ultimately, their own credibility. Now they were left with a tarnished reputation and no one else to blame. In the days that followed, the story spread among our extended family like wildfire. It was nearly impossible to keep up with the messages and phone calls flooding in. Some expressed disbelief at how brazen the lies had been. Others offered condolences, recognizing what a painful position I'd been forced into. My parents went radio silent, nursing their wounded pride and clinging to what remained of their close relationship with Alicia. But word was, even Alicia was furious with them for not stepping in more aggressively to defend her boyfriend. It was a toxic stew of blame, denial, and bitterness, and I wanted no part of it. Gradually, I came to accept that my parents might never fully acknowledge the hurt they'd caused me, skipping my wedding, lying about it, and then painting me as the villain when the truth started to emerge. If anything, their anger seemed to grow, a misdirected fury aimed at me for simply existing outside their bubble of fantasy. It hurt, of course. They were my parents, and every child yearns for unconditional love and support. But I was also determined not to let their choices define the rest of my life. In the quiet weeks that followed, I found solace in the life Kyle and I were building together. We still had boxes of wedding photos to sort through, small remnants of a day meant to be joyous despite the shadow cast by my parents' absence. I spent more time with friends who truly cared about my well-being, savoring the small affirmations of love and acceptance I found there. And I focused on my work, pouring my energy into something productive and grounded, far from the chaos of family drama. Looking back, it still stings to remember standing at the altar without my parents in sight, or flipping through wedding pictures where they should have been. But in many ways, that moment marked a turning point. Their decision to skip my wedding revealed exactly where I stood in their hierarchy of priorities, and the ensuing fallout confirmed it beyond any doubt. Sometimes, I wonder if they truly realize how destructive their actions have been, how irreparable some wounds can feel. But I also know I can't cling to that question forever. Whatever happens next, whether my parents eventually recognize the damage they've done or double down on the illusions, my life will move forward. I'll cherish the people who choose to stand by me, celebrate my milestones, and show up when it matters most. And as for that perfectly manicured facade my parents worked so hard to cultivate, well, it's gone now. The truth is out, the illusions exposed. Perhaps one day they'll see that letting the truth breathe might have spared everyone so much pain. But that's their path to walk, not mine. My journey, alongside Kyle, is leading me somewhere better, somewhere real, even if it's without them.